In the silent tension of the courtroom, the gavel had barely struck the block before the air turned heavy with unease. A commanding voice, sharp and dripping with disdain, shattered the fragile calm. The police officer uniform pressed to perfection, but his arrogance, sharper than any badge could shine, leaned forward, his eyes cold and unrelenting fixed on the woman seated at the bench. "Your Honor," he began, the title rolling off his tongue with sarcasm so thick it cut through the room like a knife. "Are we really going to pretend that someone like you can understand the gravity of this case, someone who not too long ago would have been sitting on the other side of this bench, if allowed in here at all?" The courtroom froze. Every muscle in the room tightened, every breath held. It wasn't veiled, it wasn't subtle. It was a blatant attack not just on her authority, but on her identity. "Yeah." The judge remained composed, her fingers curled around her pen just slightly tighter. Her expression didn't betray her, not yet. The officer continued his words, escalating, feeding on the silence as if daring anyone to challenge him. "It's laughable, really. This system was built for people like me to protect it, not for people like you to sit there and act like you own it. Don't think. I don't know why you're trying so hard to prove something here." The weight of his words hung in the air, the insult burning deep, not just for her, but for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. The judge, still poised, leaned forward slightly, her voice firm yet calm. "This is a courtroom, officer, not a playground for your unchecked prejudices. If you cannot respect this space, you may leave, but—" He didn't stop, his smirk widened and his tone grew more venomous. "Respect. Respect is earned. And you've done nothing to earn it from me." The whispers in the courtroom grew louder. Even those who had tried to ignore the tension couldn't look away. Now it wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about a clash that exposed the raw wounds of a system that had failed so many for so long. The judge finally stood her authority, emanating like a force field. But before she could speak, he stepped close, his voice now a sharp whisper that somehow carried through the courtroom like a shout. "You don't scare me, you're just playing dress-up in a role you were never meant to have, and deep down, you know it." The silence was deafening. Every eye was on her, waiting to see if the fire he had ignited would consume her or him. And then it happened, the moment no one saw coming. The sharp crack of her voice echoed through the room, her words cutting through his condescension like a blade. "You think this is about me? You think you can intimidate me because of your uniform, your arrogance, your ignorance? Let me remind you, officer, that this courtroom does not run on your bias. It runs on justice, and justice will always silence people like you." The tension broke, but only for a second. His smirk faltered, his composure slipping. But instead of backing down, he took a step too far. One aggressive move forward, a hand raised as if to silence her, an action meant to humiliate her publicly. The courtroom gasped, and in that instant, something shifted. She didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. Instead, she stood taller. Her voice, unwavering, carried a conviction that left the room electrified. "You will regret this," she said, her tone a promise, not a threat. What followed in the courtroom sent shockwaves through everyone present. Witnesses who once sat passively now had their phones recording the officer. Stunned by her defiance, found himself suddenly exposed, vulnerable in a way his authority couldn't protect. And as the doors to the courtroom swung open, the whispers of those outside grew louder, carrying with them questions that begged to be answered. What would happen to him now? How far would the judge go to ensure he faced justice? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, what had he underestimated in her resolve? The story was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. At Plough of Twist, we firmly stand against all forms of racism, prejudice, and discrimination. We believe in equality, amplifying voices that have been silenced for too long. To our Black audience, we see you, we hear you, and we stand with you. This channel is a space where powerful, impactful stories shine a light on truths that matter now. Get ready for a gripping story of resilience and justice. If you enjoy what you see, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss. Let's dive in. The city buzzed with an undercurrent of chaos, its streets alive with movement, a symphony of honking horns, muffled conversations, and hurried footsteps inside the courthouse. The noise from outside faded into the structured order of legal proceedings, towering ceilings, framed walls lined with shelves of law books, their spines worn and faded by years of use. It was a place where justice was supposed to prevail, where principles trumped prejudice, and where a young black woman named Simone Carter had risen against all odds. Simone had always carried herself with a quiet strength, one forged in the fires of systemic bias and relentless doubt. She was the kind of person who walked into a room and commanded respect not because she demanded it, but because she exuded competence and dignity. Her dark, natural curls framed a face that was equal parts serene and determined. At 38, she was one of the youngest judges in the district, and the first black woman to preside over cases in this particular courthouse. It was a milestone that burned her admiration from her community, but it also made her a target for those who believed she didn't belong. Simone's path to the bench was neither easy nor linear. Raised in a modest neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, she'd grown up surrounded by stories of injustice. Her father, a civil rights attorney, had spent decades fighting for marginalized communities. Her mother, a school teacher, had instilled in her a love for knowledge and an unshakable belief in fairness. As a child, Simone had watched her parents work tirelessly, their lives defined by their conviction that the system could be changed from within. That belief became her anchor, even when she saw how the world could tear people like them down. Despite her accomplishments, Simone was no stranger to the looks of disdain, the whispered doubts, and the overt challenges to her authority. She had earned her law degree from a top-tier school, graduated near the top of her class, and built a reputation as a tenacious advocate for justice during her years as a prosecutor. But to many, those achievements weren't enough in their eyes. Her skin color outweighed her credentials, and her gender undermined her authority. The courthouse itself was a microcosm of the larger world. The corridors buzzed with a mix of respect and resentment toward Simone. Some colleagues admired her brilliance and composure, while others viewed her as an outsider, an interloper in a space they believed belonged to them. Among those in the latter group was Officer Andrew Malone, a veteran of the police force with nearly 2 decades of service under his belt. Malone was a man who wore his badge like armor, believing it shielded him from accountability. His towering frame, square jaw, and piercing blue eyes were often enough to intimidate anyone who crossed his path. He was the embodiment of authority unchecked, a man whose version of justice often blurred the lines between protection and power. Malone's disdain for Simone wasn't subtle to him. She represented everything that was wrong with the system he claimed to serve. He saw her not as a judge, but as a challenge to his authority, a symbol of a shifting power dynamic that he refused to accept. Their paths had crossed on multiple occasions, always in courtrooms where Simone's rulings often went against officers like Malone. He had seen her dismiss cases where evidence was tainted, heard her question the validity of police testimonies, and watched her insist on holding law enforcement accountable. Each decision felt like a personal affront, fueling his simmering resentment. The day their confrontation unfolded, the tension was already thick. It was a case involving a young black man, barely 18, accused of assaulting an officer during a traffic stop. The prosecution's evidence was shaky at best, grainy footage that told a different story than Malone's written report. The defense argued it was yet another instance of racial profiling, and Simone had made it clear she wouldn't tolerate any shortcuts in the pursuit of justice for Malone. This was unacceptable. He had been the arresting officer, and Simone's insistence on scrutinizing every detail felt like a direct attack. The courtroom was packed that day. Reporters filled the gallery, their pens poised to document every moment. Community members had come to show their support for the defendant, while officers sat in solidarity with Malone, their presence a silent display of unity. As Simone entered the room, her black robe flowing behind her, the noise subsided. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet fire in her eyes, a determination not to let the weight of the moment crush her. Malone sat at the prosecution's table, his presence impossible to ignore. His posture was rigid, his jaw clenched, and his eyes fixated on Simone. He didn't bother hiding his disdain when the proceedings began. His interruptions were frequent, his tone laced with condescension. Each time Simone calmly redirected him, her voice steady, her authority unshaken, but it was clear that the tension between them was building, an invisible threat tightening with every word as the case unfolded. The discrepancies in the evidence became glaringly obvious. The defense painted a picture of a young man caught in the crosshairs of a system that saw him as guilty before proven innocent. Simone's questions were sharp, her focus unwavering. She pressed the prosecution on the inconsistencies, her tone firm but unfair. Malone's frustration grew with each passing moment, his face reading as he watched his case unravel. By the time the defense rested, the courtroom was buzzing with anticipation. Simone paused, her gaze sweeping the room, taking in every face before turning her attention to Malone. Her voice was calm, but carried an edge of steel as she addressed the jury, outlining the standards of evidence required for a conviction. It was clear she wasn't going to allow prejudice to dictate the outcome as she delivered her final instructions. Malone's anger boiled over. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, drawing eyes to him. The tension in the room reached a breaking point. What came next would alter the course of both their lives and leave everyone in that courtroom questioning what justice truly meant. The scrape of Malone's chair against the floor reverberated through the courtroom, a sharp disruption to the fragile order Simone had worked tirelessly to maintain. Every pair of eyes turned toward him and turned toward him. In that instant, the atmosphere shifted. He didn't bother masking the hostility etched across his face, his movements slow and deliberate as if daring anyone to stop him. "Your Honor," he said, his voice low but laced with venom, "I have to question the integrity of these proceedings." The room seemed to hold its breath. Simone remained seated, her expression calm, though her fingers tightened slightly on the edge of her bench. She measured her response, each word precise. "Officer Malone, if you have concerns regarding the proceedings, you may voice them through the appropriate channels. However, this is not the time nor the place to undermine the court," he smirked, leaning forward, his large frame towering over the desk in front of him. "Appropriate channels? You mean the ones designed to protect people like you when they step out of their depth?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom, disbelief mixing with outrage. Simone's jaw clenched, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she leaned back slightly, folding her hands in front of her. "I would caution you," she said evenly, her voice carrying authority, "against making statements that have no relevance to the case at hand." Malone's smirk grew whiter, and his voice rose slightly now, addressing not just her but the entire courtroom. "The case at hand, let's talk about that. We've got a repeat offender who resisted arrest, attacked an officer, and somehow he's the victim now. This whole charade is nothing more than a platform for you to push your agenda." The courtroom erupted into a cacophony of gasps and whispers, reporters scribbling furiously as Simone tapped her gavel twice to restore order. Her voice cut through the chaos. Sharp, unyielding, "This court will not tolerate personal attacks or baseless accusations." "One more outburst, Officer Malone, and you will be held in contempt." But the threat didn't land as she intended. Malone's glare intensified, his body radiating defiance. He took a step closer to the bench, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that was still audible to everyone. "You think you can control this courtroom? You can't even control the narrative outside these walls. People know what's happening here, Your Honor. And trust me, they're watching." Simone locked eyes with him, refusing to look away. "You're right," she said, her voice steady but firm. "People are watching. Which is why I will continue to uphold the law without bias or intimidation. Now, sit down for a moment." It seemed like he might push further, his fists clenching at his sides, but then, with a scoff, he dropped back into his seat, his frustration visible in every tense movement. The courtroom slowly settled. Though the tension remained palpable as the proceedings continued, it became clear that the defense had built a strong case. Witnesses testified to inconsistencies in the police report, and the video footage revealed gaps in Malone's version of events. Each revelation chipped away at his credibility, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. By the time the defense rested, the energy in the room was electric. A charged anticipation hanging in the air. When the court adjourned for the day, Simone retreated to her chambers, her mind racing. The weight of the day, PR, heavily on her shoulders. She refused to let it consume her. She knew this case was about more than one young man's freedom. It was about the broader fight for accountability and justice, yet the hostility she faced from Malone and his supporters was a stark reminder of how deeply entrenched the resistance to change remained. Malone was pacing in the hallway outside the courtroom, his anger barely contained. His colleagues tried to calm him, but he waved them off, his voice rising. "This is a joke. She's making a mockery of everything we stand for." One officer, a younger man with an uneasy expression, spoke hesitantly. "Andrew, maybe it's not worth it. You're letting this get too personal." Malone rounded on him, his eyes blazing. "Personal? You think this isn't personal for her? She's using that bench to undermine everything we do. If we let her win, it sets a precedent. We can't let that happen." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the reporters still lingering nearby. "Maybe we should let the evidence speak for itself. Pushing this too hard could backfire." Malone shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Backfire? No. What's happening in there is what happens when you let them take over. Someone needs to remind her who really runs this city." As the evening wore on, both Simone and Malone prepared for the next day's hearing in their own ways. Simone reviewed the case files late into the night, her determination outweighing her exhaustion. She knew the odds were stacked against her, not just because of the case itself, but because of the unspoken biases that permeated the system. Yet she resolved to stay the course, no matter the cost. Malone, on the other hand, wasn't planning to rely on the legal system to make his point. Fueled by anger and a sense of entitlement, he began making calls, rallying support from those who shared his views. To him, this wasn't just a case, it was a battle for control, and he wasn't willing to lose. The following day, the courtroom was even more packed than before. Reporters jostled for position. Community members filled the seats, and the tension was palpable. As Simone entered, she felt the weight of every gaze on her, but she refused to let it show. She took her seat, prepared to continue the proceedings. Malone was already seated, his expression hard and unreadable, but as the hearing resumed, it became clear that he was losing ground. The defense's arguments were strong, their evidence compelling. Each point they made seemed to drive Malone closer to the edge. His frustration, visible to anyone paying attention, and then it happened, a moment so small it could have gone unnoticed. But Simone caught it, a flicker of unease in Malone's expression as the defense questioned a key piece of evidence. It was enough to spark her curiosity, enough to make her wonder if there was more to his story than met the eye. As the day drew to a close, the courtroom buzzed with speculation. Simone adjourned the hearing, her mind racing with possibilities. She sensed that the case was on the verge of a breakthrough, but she couldn't yet see how it would unfold. All she knew was that the truth was closer than ever, and that when it came to light, it would change everything. The courtroom was quieter than it had been in days, but the silence carried a weight that pressed against every person. In the room, the atmosphere felt charged, as if the air itself was waiting for something to happen. Simone Carter sat behind the bench, her hands resting lightly on the desk in front of her. She appeared composed, but inside her thoughts raced. The defense's final argument had been strong, too strong to ignore. The evidence against the young defendant, already shaky, was unraveling by the second, and the cracks were becoming impossible to cover up across the room. Andrew Malone sat rigid in his seat, his jaw tight and his fists Clenched against the table, he hadn't spoken since the last witness had been dismissed, but his silence was far more telling than any burst. His gaze burned into Simone as if he could will her to falter through sheer force of his disdain. But she didn't. Flinch didn't acknowledge him, even as the tension between them grew unbearable. The defense attorney, a sharp, methodical man with a calm demeanor, stood once more, his voice cutting through the stillness. He turned toward Malone, holding a paper in his hand that trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from the weight of what he was about to say. Your Honor, as we've demonstrated, the narrative presented by the prosecution relies heavily on Officer Malone's testimony. Yet there's something that hasn't been addressed, something critical to understanding the motivations behind this arrest. Simone straightened slightly in her chair, her attention fixed on him. She hadn't expected this. There had been no indication of an additional revelation, no hint that the defense was about to upend everything once again. She glanced at the jury, who leaned forward. Hanging on to every word, the defense attorney took a breath and then held up a report. Your Honor, we have obtained records indicating that Officer Malone has a history of misconduct complaints, many of which involve racially motivated incidents. These records were not disclosed by the prosecution, despite their clear relevance to this case. A murmur swept through the room, growing louder with each second reporter scribbled. Furiously, their cameras clicking while members of the jury exchanged wide-eyed glances. Simone felt her stomach tighten. This wasn't just another piece of evidence, it was a bombshell. She raised her hand, her voice cutting through the noise. Order in the court, counsel. Are you prepared to substantiate these claims? The defense attorney nodded, his expression steady. Yes, Your Honor. These records were filed with the department's Internal Affairs Division, but were never acted upon. We also have corroborating witness statements that point to a clear pattern of targeting individuals based on race. Simone's gaze flickered to Malone, who had gone pale, for a man who had exuded nothing but arrogance and bravado. The sudden change in his demeanor was striking. His composure was cracking, his carefully constructed image of authority and control slipping through his fingers. Malone stood abruptly, his voice sharp and defensive. This is a smear campaign, Your Honor. They're trying to undermine the credibility of this case because they know they're losing. Simone's eyes locked onto his, her tone calm but unyielding. Officer Malone, you will have the opportunity to respond when called upon. For now, I suggest you remain seated. His mouth opened as if to argue, but something in her gaze stopped him. He sat back down, though his body remained tense, his fists still clenched on the table. The defense attorney continued, now addressing the jury. This isn't just about one arrest, it's about a pattern of behavior. One that calls into question the very foundation of this case. If Officer Malone has a history of falsifying reports or targeting individuals unjustly, how can we trust his account of what happened that night? Simone let the words hang in the air for a moment before speaking. The court will recess for 1 hour to allow both sides to review this new evidence. We will reconvene promptly. She struck the gavel, and the room erupted into chaos. Reporters swarmed toward the defense attorney, while community members whispered furiously among themselves. Simone retreated to her chambers, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on her. She could feel the cracks forming, not just in the case, but in the walls Malone had built around himself for the first time. She saw fear in his eyes, and it unsettled her in the hallway. Malone cornered the prosecution's lead attorney, his voice a harsh whisper. You didn't tell me they had that. How the hell did this happen? The attorney looked flustered, his hands raised in defense. I didn't know, that wasn't in the files we reviewed. Malone stepped closer, his voice lowering but losing none of its intensity. Fix it. I don't care what you have to do, just fix it. But the attorney shook his head. It's too late. The jury's seen it. They've heard it. We can't unring that bell. Malone swore under his breath. His frustration boiling over, he turned and stormed toward the exit, ignoring the reporters who called his name. Outside, the sky had darkened, heavy clouds threatening rain, mirroring the storm brewing within him. Back in the courtroom, the hour passed quickly. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was different. There was a charge in the air, an anticipation that something irreversible was about to happen. Simone resumed her seat, her face calm but her mind alert. The defense presented the evidence, laying out a damning timeline of complaints and incidents involving Malone. Each revelation hit harder than the last, eroding the foundation of the prosecution's case. Malone's face was a mask of defiance, but his eyes betrayed him. He glanced toward the jury, toward the gallery, toward Simone, as if searching for an escape that wasn't there when the defense rested. He stood once again, this time addressing Simone directly. "Your Honor, this is a farce. You're letting them tarnish my reputation, my career, based on unsubstantiated claims?" Simone met his gaze, her voice steady but laced with authority. "Officer Malone, the evidence presented is now a matter of record. If you wish to refute it, you may do so under oath." For a moment, it seemed like he might take the stand, but then he hesitated. His silence spoke louder than any words could have. Simone turned to the jury, her expression unreadable. "The court will now recess for deliberation. The jury is instructed to weigh the evidence carefully and return with a verdict as the jury filed out." Simone glanced once more at Malone. His arrogance was gone, replaced by something almost resembling fear. She had seen men like him before, men who believed their power made them untouchable. But today, the cracks were showing. Today, justice felt within reach. And as the door closed behind the jury, the weight of what was coming settled over the room like a storm ready to break the courtroom, was heavy with tension, the air thick and unmoving, as if everyone present was holding their collective breath. Simone sat at her bench, her face calm, but her mind racing. The defense had just revealed an inconsistency in the evidence. A small crack in the case that could shatter the entire structure. It was subtle but significant. And she knew it wasn't something Malone had anticipated. His earlier confidence now seemed more like bravado masking desperation. Malone stood at the prosecution table, his body rigid, his fists clenched on the edge of the desk. His voice, when he spoke, carried an edge of panic disguised as anger. "This is ridiculous. We're really going to let a single discrepancy overshadow everything. This is what happens when we coddle criminals and ignore the work of law." Enforcement. Simone leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto his. "Officer Malone, this court is concerned with the facts, not emotional appeals. The evidence is either reliable or it isn't, and it's my duty to ensure that only the truth informs the jury's decision." He glared at her, his jaw tightening. "And who determines what's truth here? You? A judge who's more interested in making a statement than injustice?" The room erupted in murmurs, the spectators too engrossed in the drama to remember decorum. Simone tapped her gavel twice, her voice cutting through the noise with practiced authority. "Order. This is your last warning, Officer Malone. If you cannot maintain professionalism, I will hold you in contempt." His lips twisted into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, of course. "Your Honor, professionalism." The defense attorney, a young but sharp woman named Camille Diaz, rose from her seat, her expression neutral but her tone calculated. "Your Honor, the defense would like to present additional documentation that supports our claim of inconsistencies in the prosecution's evidence." Malone's head snapped toward her, his face flushing. "What? Documentation? This is a stunt? An attempt to derail the case because they know their client is guilty?" Simone's voice was steady but firm as she addressed Camille. "Proceed." "Ms. Diaz?" Camille handed a folder to the bailiff, who brought it to Simone as she flipped through the pages, her brow furrowed slightly. The documents were detailed, meticulous in their presentation, and pictures highlighted a troubling pattern. Malone shifted uneasily, his fingers tapping against the table as if trying to expend the nervous energy coursing through him. Camille spoke with measured confidence, her voice carrying across the room. "These records show a history of altered reports submitted by Officer Malone in cases involving young black men. The inconsistencies are not isolated to this case. In fact, they form a pattern that calls into question his credibility as a witness and as an investigator." The murmur of the crowd grew louder, the weight of the revelation rippling through the room like a tidal wave. Simone set the folder down, her expression unreadable as she looked at Malone. "Officer Malone, do you wish to respond to these allegations?" His face darkened, his voice rising, despite himself. "This is absurd. Those are baseless accusations, and I won't sit here and be slandered in front of the entire courtroom." Simone's gaze didn't waver. "The court is not slandering you, Officer Malone. It is examining evidence, which is its duty. Do you deny that these reports were altered?" He hesitated, the pause longer than it should have been. The silence spoke louder than any admission, and the spectators leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something was unraveling. Finally, he snapped, his voice filled with frustration. "I did what I had to do to ensure justice. Sometimes the system doesn't work the way it should. And you have to make tough calls, but I never lied." Camille was quick to respond, her tone sharp. "Ensuring justice by falsifying records, Officer Malone, that's a dangerous justification, especially when it disproportionately affects certain groups." His anger boiled over, his voice rising. "You have no idea what it's like out there. You sit in your offices and in this courtroom pretending to understand the realities of the streets. You don't know what it's like to face danger every day, to deal with people who hate you just for wearing the uniform." Simone's voice cut through his tete, calm but commanding. "And does that justify compromising the very integrity of the system you claim to protect? Does it justify targeting individuals based on their race, or bending the rules to suit your narrative?" His silence was damning. He looked away, his eyes darting to the officers seated in the gallery. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, their expressions betraying a mix of loyalty and doubt. He had been their leader, their example, but now that example was crumbling under scrutiny. Simone exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She addressed the court, her voice steady despite the tension. "This is not just about one case or one defendant. It's about the principles we uphold, the integrity of the system, and the trust that the public places in us. If we fail to hold ourselves accountable, we fail the people we are meant to serve." The room fell silent. The gravity of her words settling over everyone for the first time. Malone looked smaller. His confidence diminished, his authority questioned. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The truth was laid bare, and there was no escaping it. Simone adjourned the court for the day, leaving everyone to process what had just unfolded as she walked back to her chambers. The weight of the case pressed heavily on her shoulders, but she knew one thing with certainty: the fight for justice wasn't over. What came next would determine not just the outcome of this case, but the future of everyone involved. The courtroom was quieter than it had been in days, but the tension was no less suffocating. Everyone present knew they were witnessing the aftermath of something monumental. The case had become a microcosm of a much larger conflict, and now every word and every decision carried the weight of something far greater than just one trial. Simone entered the courtroom, her expression unretreatable as always, but those who had observed her closely over the past few days might have noticed the faint trace of exhaustion in her eyes. It wasn't fatigue from lack of sleep. It was the burden of navigating a system that constantly tested her resolve. She took her seat, adjusted her rope, and gave a measured nod to the bailiff. The trial was resuming, but the atmosphere was different. It wasn't just about justice for the defendant anymore. It was about holding the system accountable. Camille Diaz stood her confidence. Bolstered by the cracks that had formed in Malone's defense, her voice was steady but carried the weight of conviction as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, the defense requests to introduce one final witness. This individual has direct knowledge of Officer Malone's conduct and can speak to the broader implications of his actions." Simone considered the request, her gaze sweeping the courtroom. "You may proceed." The door at the back of the room opened and a man walked in. He was younger than expected, with a nervous energy that he tried to conceal. He took the stand, glancing at the jury, then at Simone before settling his gaze on Camille. She began gently, knowing the gravity of what she was asking him to do. Please state your name, occupation. For the record, he cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus Taylor. I'm a former officer with the department. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Though Simone remained composed, Camille pressed on. Mr. Taylor, you resigned from the force recently. Could you explain why? Marcus hesitated, his eyes darting toward Malone, whose face was now a mask of barely concealed rage. Marcus took a deep breath, then spoke. I left because I couldn't be part of it anymore. The lies, the cover-ups, the targeting of certain communities. It wasn't what I signed up for. Camille nodded, her tone calm, but probing. When you say targeting, are you referring to specific instances or a broader pattern? Marcus swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edges of the stand. Both there were cases like this one, where evidence was manipulated to make the suspect look guilty. Reports were altered and officers were encouraged to stick to a story, even if it wasn't true. But it wasn't just individual cases, it was a mindset. Certain neighborhoods were treated as war zones, and the people who lived there weren't seen as citizens, they were seen as threats. The murmurs began again, louder this time, and Simone raised her hand to quiet the room. Her voice was steady as she addressed Marcus. Mr. Taylor, I need you to be specific. Are you alleging that Officer Malone engaged in this behavior? Marcus looked directly at her, then at Malone. His voice shook, but his words were clear. Yes, he was one of the worst. He didn't just follow orders, he gave them. He told us to make arrests, to find reasons to stop people, to clean up the streets, as he put it. And if we couldn't find a reason, we made one. Malone shot to his feet, his voice booming. This is a joke. He's a disgruntled ex-employee with an axe to grind. He's lying, and everyone here knows it. Simone's gavel struck sharply, cutting through the commotion. Her voice was firm. Sit down, Officer Malone. You'll have your chance to respond. He reluctantly obeyed. His jaw clenched so tightly it looked as if it might shatter. Marcus continued, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. It's not just me. There are others who've seen it, but they're too scared to come forward. The culture in the department doesn't allow for dissent. If you speak out, you're ostracized or worse. Camille seized the moment, and yet you've chosen to come forward today. Why? Marcus's eyes flicked to Simone before returning to Camille. Because it's the right thing to do. Because I'm tired of being silent while people like Officer Malone destroy lives, and because if we don't start holding people accountable, nothing will ever change. The room was silent again, but this time the silence was different. It wasn't just tension, it was a collective reckoning. The weight of Marcus's words settled over everyone like a fog, impossible to ignore or dispel. Simone leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing as she addressed Marcus. Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Taylor. Your courage in coming forward is noted, Malone. However, it wasn't done. He stood again, his face flushed with anger. This is a smear campaign. None of this is relevant to the case at hand. This is about one suspect and one incident, not some grand conspiracy. Simone turned her gaze to him, her tone sharp. Sit down, Officer Malone. This court will determine what is relevant. He didn't move at first, his defiance clear, but then slowly he returned to his seat, his frustration boiling just beneath the surface. Simone let the silence linger for a moment before turning back to Camille. Does the defense have anything further? Camille nodded. Not at this time, Your Honor. Simone exhaled quietly, her hands resting on the edge of the bench. She addressed the jury, her voice steady but carrying the weight of everything that had transpired. This court has been presented with a great deal of evidence, much of which calls into question the integrity of the case before us. It is now your duty to determine the truth and to ensure that justice is served as the jury was dismissed to deliberate. The room buzzed with an energy that felt both electric and somber. The trial wasn't over, but the truth was out in the open, and it was clear that nothing would be the same again. Simone sat back in her chair, watching as the courtroom emptied, knowing that the next steps would be the most critical of all. The jury room door closed with a weighty thud, leaving the courtroom in an uneasy stillness. The deliberations had begun, but the tension outside those walls was no less intense. Simone remained at her bench, quietly observing the room as people filed out in clusters. Some spoke in hushed tones, their voices carrying the weight of disbelief and anger. Others moved in. Silenced their faces, a mix of shock and contemplation. Officer Malone, however, stayed rooted at the prosecution table, his gaze fixed on Simone, a quiet storm brewing behind his icy eyes. Camille was gathering her papers, her movements calm but deliberate, her satisfaction carefully contained. She felt the tide turning but knew better than to celebrate prematurely as she slid the last file into her briefcase. Malone's voice cut through the silence, low but unmistakable. "This isn't over. You think you've won something, but you don't. Understand what you've started?" Simone lifted her eyes to meet his, her voice even but firm. "Officer Malone, if you have anything to say that is relevant to the case, you may file a formal motion. Otherwise, I suggest you keep your comments to yourself." He ignored her, standing abruptly. In turning to Camille, his tone was sharp, his words dripping with contempt. "You and your client have made a mockery of this court, twisting facts, dragging my name through the mud, all to push your agenda. But let me tell you something, people like you don't change anything. You're a moment, not a movement." Camille didn't flinch. Instead, she straightened her voice, calm but resolute. "And people like you rely on that belief to stay in power. You think the system will always protect you, that accountability is for everyone else, but today proves otherwise." "This is just the beginning," Malone scoffed, his laugh bitter and humorless. "You think you've exposed something new? The world doesn't care. They'll forget about this trial in a week and I'll still be here." Simone's voice cut in sharp and commanding. "Enough, Officer Malone. Your conduct in this court has already been unacceptable, and I will not allow further disruption. Leave now or face contempt charges." For a moment, it seemed as though he might challenge her again, but then he turned sharply, his footsteps heavy as he stormed out of the courtroom. The door slammed behind him, echoing through the emptying space. Simone exhaled slowly, her gaze lingering on the door for a moment before she turned to Camille. "You handled yourself well today, Ms. Diaz. This case is as much about persistence as it is about the facts, and you've demonstrated both." Camille gave a small appreciative nod, but her expression remained serious. "Thank you, Your Honor. But the fight isn't over yet. We still have to wait for the jury." Simone nodded, the weight of the truth evident in her eyes. "It's out of our hands now. All we can do is trust that they will see the truth." Hours passed, the clock ticking steadily as the courthouse began to empty. The uncrowded halls were now quiet, the energy of the day dissipating into an uneasy calm. Simone remained in her chambers, the soft glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. She thumbed through files, her mind not on the words before her, but on the larger implications of the trial. This wasn't just about one case or one officer. It was about a system that had allowed people like Malone to operate unchecked for far too long. The knock on her door startled her out of her thoughts. It was Camille, her expression cautious but hopeful. "Your Honor, the jury has reached a verdict." Simone nodded, rising from her chair and donning her robe. The weight of the moment pressed down on her shoulders as she made her way back to the courtroom. The gallery had refilled, though the mood was markedly different from before. Anticipation and anxiety hung in the air, the tension palpable. The jury filed in there as unreadable. The Ferez handed a folded piece of paper to the bailiff, who delivered it to Simone. She unfolded it carefully, her expression neutral as her eyes scanned the words. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, the silence thick and oppressive. She handed the paper back to the bailiff, her voice steady but firm as she addressed the court. "Will the defendant please rise?" The young man at the defense table stood, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. Camille stood beside him, her presence calm and steady, a quiet reassurance. Simone turned to the jury, her voice carrying across the room. "Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" The four stood, their voice clear but heavy with emotion. "Yes, Your Honor." Simone gave a small nod. "Please state your verdict." The foreperson's voice carried the weight of the moment. On the charge of assaulting a police officer, we find the defendant not guilty. The words seemed to echo through the courtroom, the silence that followed heavier than any sound. For a moment no one moved, no one spoke. Then the room erupted. The defendant's family cried out in relief, tears streaming down their faces as they clung to one another. Camille let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, a small, triumphant smile breaking through her composure. Malone, seated at the prosecution table, looked as though the air had been sucked from his lungs. His face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is a farce," he muttered, his voice rising. "A complete miscarriage of justice." Simone's gavel struck sharply, her voice cutting through the noise. "Order, Officer Malone. Sit down or leave this courtroom immediately." He hesitated, his body rigid with tension, but eventually he turned and stormed out the door, slamming shut behind him. The sound was final, like the closing of a chapter. Simone addressed the room, her voice calm but firm. "This court is adjourned." As people began to file out, Simone remained seated, watching as the young man and his family embraced. Their relief was palpable, a stark contrast to the tension that had defined the trial. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel a small measure of satisfaction. Justice, however imperfect, had been served, but she knew the fight wasn't over. This was one victory in a much larger battle, and there was still much work to be done. The courthouse was quieter now, the intensity of the trial finally giving way to a sense of closure. Simone Carter sat in her chambers, the sounds of the bustling world outside muffled by the thick walls. The verdict had been delivered, the jury had gone home, and the young man who had been at the center of the trial was free. But for Simone, the work wasn't over. She leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow breath as she reflected on what the case had revealed, not just about the defendant, but about the system itself and the people who sought to manipulate it. Camille Diaz entered, her usual composed demeanor softened by the weight of the day. She held a folder in one hand and a small smile on her lips. "Your Honor, I just wanted to thank you before I head out. Your fairness, your strength, it made all the difference," Simone returned, a smile, a genuine but weary expression, crossing her face. "The credit belongs to you and your client. You fought for the truth, and that's what this court is here to uphold." Camille hesitated, her smile fading slightly as her voice dropped to a more serious tone. "Malone won't stop here. Men like him don't take defeat lightly. Be careful." Simone nodded, her expression firm. "I've faced people like him my entire career, Ms. Diaz. They thrive on fear and intimidation, but they're powerless against resilience. And accountability today wasn't just a victory for this case. It was a message." As Camille left, Simone turned her attention to the papers scattered across her desk. Among them was the file that had unraveled Malone's carefully constructed facade. She flipped through it, her mind turning over what had come to light. Malone's pattern of behavior, his willingness to bend the truth had been exposed, but the question lingered. How many others like him were still operating unchecked? In a stark contrast to Simone's quiet resolve, Malone's world was unraveling. He sat alone in his car, the engine off, the silence around him oppressive. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he replayed the events of the trial in his mind. His carefully cultivated image had been shattered, his authority questioned, his credibility in tatters. He knew the fallout was only beginning. Already internal investigations had been launched, his name splashed across headlines, his actions scrutinized in ways they never had been before. Malone's phone buzzed on the dashboard, the screen lighting up with calls and messages he couldn't bring himself to answer. Support from his peers was waning, his allies in the department distancing themselves as the evidence against him mounted. He had always believed himself untouchable, protected by the badge and untouchable. The culture that came with it. Now he was learning just how fragile that protection could be. When the truth came to light, the young man at the heart of the case, Marcus Williams, walked out of the courthouse into the embrace of his family. His mother's tears soaked his shoulder as she clung to him, her relief palpable. For Marcus, freedom felt surreal, like a weight had been lifted from his chest, yet he couldn't shake the anger and frustration of what he had endured. He looked over his shoulder at the courthouse, at the place where his life had nearly been stolen from him, and vowed silently that he would do everything in his power to ensure no one else would have to go through the same ordeal. Days later, the headlines shifted. Officer Malone had resigned from the force amid growing pressure and allegations of misconduct. Beyond the case in Simone's courtroom, investigations revealed a pattern of behavior that extended back years, implicating not only him but others who had covered for him. The department, under scrutiny from the public and the media, announced sweeping reforms, including independent oversight and mandatory training programs designed to address the biases that had allowed officers like Malone to thrive. For Simone, the news was a validation of everything she had fought for, but it was also a reminder of how much work remained. Change was slow, often met with resistance, but it was possible. She attended a community meeting a week after the trial, standing before a room full of people who had gathered to discuss ways to hold the system accountable. Her words were met with applause. Her presence, a symbol of hope for many who had felt powerless for so long. Marcus, too, found himself drawn to advocacy. He began speaking at schools, sharing his story, encouraging young people to understand their rights and to believe in their worth. His voice carried the weight of experience, and his passion resonated with those who heard him. He had been a victim of a broken system, but he refused to let that define him. Instead, he chose to become a force for change. Simone watched his progress with pride, knowing that his resilience was a testament to the power of standing firm in the face of adversity. She continued her work on the bench, her rulings a reflection of her unwavering commitment to justice. The trial had been one chapter in a much larger story, but it was a chapter that had sparked something bigger, a movement toward accountability, toward equity, toward a future where the truth could no longer be ignored. As the dust settled, Simone sat in her chambers looking out the window at the city skyline. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the challenges she had faced, the battles she had fought, and the victories she had earned. She knew there would always be more to do, more people to help, more systems to change, but for the first time in a long time she felt a sense of peace, a quiet assurance that her work mattered and that she was exactly where she was meant to be. This story reminds us of the power of resilience, the importance of standing up for what's right even when the odds are stacked against you. It's a story about accountability, about holding people in positions of power responsible for their actions, and about the strength it takes to fight for justice in a system that often feels designed to resist it. It's a story that asks us to reflect on our own role in creating change, to consider how we can challenge the systems and mindset that perpetuate inequality. What did this story make you feel? Did you see yourself in any of the characters or their struggles? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for more stories that inspire challenge and leave you thinking long after they're over. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.